Imagine it's the 12th of October 2001. You are a 43-year-old accountant living in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Your apartment on Avenida Corrientes is modest but comfortable. You have spent 20 years building your savings, nearly $18,000 sitting in a Banco Nación account, the fruit of 2 decades of careful, disciplined living. You pay your bills on time. You have a small life insurance policy. You own some government bonds because your financial advisor told you they were the safest thing in the world. You drink your coffee in the morning and read the newspaper and worry a little about the headlines, but mostly trust that the institutions around you will hold. They always have. That is what institutions are for. If you have ever wondered why the things people work a lifetime to accumulate can vanish in a matter of weeks, not because of bad decisions, not because of bad luck, but because the system underneath them quietly dissolved, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. A repeating pattern that has appeared in Argentina, in Zimbabwe, in Lebanon, in Weimar Germany, in the Soviet Union, and in a dozen other places. Across 100 years of modern history, it has happened before. It will happen again. And the things that become worthless when it does are almost never the things people expected. And if this kind of historical clarity is something you find valuable, subscribing takes 2 seconds. It keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Now back to Buenos Aires. 2 months after that ordinary October morning, the Argentine government froze every bank account in the country. The policy was called the corralito. It means little fence. A little fence around your money. You could not withdraw more than 250 pesos per week. The exchange rate was locked, and then it was not. When the peso was finally allowed to float freely in early 2002, it lost nearly 70% of its value almost overnight. Your $18,000 became something closer to $5,000 in purchasing power. And your government bonds, the safe ones, the guaranteed ones, the ones your advisor called risk-free, Argentina defaulted on $132 billion of sovereign debt. The bonds were toilet paper, not metaphorically, literally worth less than the paper they were printed on. This video is about 5 things that become nearly worthless when a nation breaks down. Not stocks, not crypto, not exotic assets that only sophisticated investors hold. We are talking about things that ordinary working people trust with their lives, things that feel like bedrock, things that feel permanent. Understanding why they fail is not a pessimistic exercise. It is the most practical thing you can do, because the mechanism behind their failure is always the same, and it has never once made an exception. Before we go further, there is something important to understand about how national breakdown actually works. Most people imagine it as a sudden crash, a moment, a day when everything changes. But history shows something far more unsettling. Collapse is not a fire. It is a river changing course. The water does not disappear overnight. It just stops flowing where it used to flow. And by the time most people notice, the riverbed they were standing in has been dry for a long time. The mechanism beneath all 5 of the things we are about to discuss is the same. It is a breakdown of trust, specifically a breakdown of the trust that holds contracts together. Think of a modern economy as a vast web of promises. The government promises your currency is worth something. The bank promises your deposit is safe. The pension fund promises to pay you when you retire. The landlord promises to honor the lease. The employer promises to pay the wages they agreed to. All of these are promises, contracts, legal agreements backed by institutional enforcement. When a nation breaks down, through hyperinflation, debt default, civil collapse, or political disintegration, what actually breaks is not just the economy. It is the machinery that enforces those promises. And when enforcement collapses, every promise in the system becomes negotiable. And when every promise becomes negotiable, the thing that promise was supposed to deliver becomes worthless. Now let us look at exactly what that means in practice, one thing at a time. The first thing that becomes nearly worthless when a nation breaks down is paper currency. This sounds obvious, but the way it happens is almost never what people expect. People imagine that currency collapses all at once, that they wake up one day and the money is gone. The reality is far more cruel and far more gradual. Currency collapse is a slow erosion that suddenly becomes a cliff. Look at what happened in Weimar Germany. After the First World War, Germany was forced to pay enormous war reparations, roughly $33 billion in modern terms. To pay these bills, the German government did what desperate governments do. It printed money. At first, inflation was manageable, uncomfortable but manageable. By 1921, a loaf of bread in Berlin cost around 1 mark. By the summer of 1922, it cost 200 marks. By November 1923, it cost 200 billion marks. Not a typo, 200 billion. A single loaf of bread. Wheelbarrows full of currency became a famous image of that era. People were paid twice a day because prices rose faster than once daily paychecks could account for. A German woman named Frau Eisenmenger wrote in her diary about going to the market with a basket full of banknotes and coming home with a basket full of groceries that could barely feed her family for a day. The baskets reversed. Money became weight. Food became value. The mechanism is straightforward. When a government prints money faster than the economy produces goods and services, each unit of currency represents a smaller and smaller share of the actual wealth. It is like diluting soup. Add enough water, and you no longer have soup. You have hot water with a memory of soup. German citizens who had saved for decades, who had done everything right, who had kept their money in banks and bonds and state savings accounts, saw their life savings effectively erased. Not stolen, not lost, erased by dilution. And the cruel irony is that the people with the least savings, those who spent their income immediately on physical goods, actually survived better. Having nothing to lose meant having nothing to lose. The same pattern appeared in Zimbabwe beginning around 2007. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe printed money to cover government deficits and land redistribution payments. By November 2008, Zimbabwe's inflation rate hit an estimated 89.7 sextillion% per month, a number so large it barely has meaning. The government issued a $100 trillion banknote. It could buy 2 loaves of bread. Today, those notes sell as collector's items on eBay for $5 to $20 US, more than they were ever worth in Zimbabwe. The currency became literally more valuable as a souvenir than as a medium of exchange. Currency fails not because people lose faith in the paper. People lose faith in the promise that the paper represents. And when the promise breaks, the paper is just paper. This leads to the second part of this story. The second thing that becomes nearly worthless when a nation breaks down is bank deposits. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. When you look at your bank account balance on your phone right now, what exactly are you looking at? Is it money? Or is it a number in a database that represents a promise made by an institution? Drop your answer in the comments, seriously, because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear. And it changes everything. Your bank deposit is not a vault with your name on it. It is a loan you make to the bank. The bank takes your money, lends most of it out to other people, and gives you back a number on a screen with a promise to convert that number back to cash whenever you want. This system works beautifully when everyone trusts it. It collapses with breathtaking speed when they do not. In Cyprus, in March 2013, the European Union and IMF agreed to a bailout. But there was a condition. Depositors with more than 100,000 euros in Cypriot banks would have a portion of their deposits seized directly to help fund the bailout. This was called a bail-in, not a bailout, where governments use public money to rescue banks. A bail-in, where depositors use their own money to rescue the bank holding their deposits. Depositors at the Bank of Cyprus with over 100,000 euros lost approximately 47.5% of their deposits overnight. Not through inflation, not through bad investment, through direct seizure, legal, state-sanctioned seizure. Think about what that means for a business owner in Nicosia who had saved 200,000 euros to make payroll. Monday morning they woke up with roughly 106,000 euros. Their business plan, their commitments, their contracts, all written around a number that no longer existed. Dozens of businesses folded, not because they were badly run, but because the deposit they had built their operations around was no longer there. The floor gave way, but the cracks had been spreading for years. Lebanon tells an even more harrowing version of this story. In October 2019, banks in Lebanon began imposing informal capital controls, meaning they restricted how much cash people could withdraw from their own accounts. By 2020, those restrictions had become near total. Lebanese who had accounts denominated in US dollars found that they could not access their dollars. Banks were only allowing withdrawals in Lebanese pounds at an artificial exchange rate set by the government. If you had $100,000 in a Lebanese bank account by late 2021, the real purchasing power of what you could actually access was closer to $15,000 to $20,000. Your money was there, on paper, in the database, but it had become a number in a system that would not give it back to you. The deposits had been transformed from assets into hostages. Now here's where it gets interesting, and more than a little uncomfortable. Because the third thing that becomes nearly worthless when a nation breaks down is government bonds and pension promises. These are considered among the safest investments in the world. They are what pension funds, insurance companies, and conservative investors hold when they want something risk-free. The entire logic of a government bond is that governments do not go bankrupt the way companies do. Governments can always print money. They can always tax. They are the last institution standing. This logic is true, right up until it is not. Argentina's 2001 default was the largest sovereign debt default in world history up to that point, $132 billion. Holders of Argentine government bonds received initially nothing. After years of negotiations, bondholders eventually received settlements worth 30 to 40 cents on the dollar. Greece between 2010 and 2012 forced a similar reckoning. In what was called the private sector involvement, holders of Greek government bonds accepted a 53.5% reduction. The total economic loss for bondholders was closer to 75 to 80% in present value terms. Pension funds across Europe absorbed catastrophic losses. When the Soviet Union dissolved, the pension system that had served hundreds of millions of people across the USSR simply ceased to exist in its original form. Russian pensioners in the early 1990s received pensions denominated in rubles. The ruble collapsed. Annual inflation in Russia hit around 2,500% in 1992. Millions of elderly Russians who had worked their entire lives found themselves in poverty because the system dissolved. Most people will never know what you now know. Hit subscribe. Now observe what all of these cases have in common. The government faces a financial gap. It prints money, confiscates assets, or defaults, acknowledging that promises cannot be honored. All three paths arrive at the same destination. The promises collapse, and whatever was backed by those promises becomes worthless. The river changed course. The old riverbed dried up. The fourth thing that becomes nearly worthless when a nation breaks down is professional credentials and formal employment status. This sounds almost absurd. How can a medical degree become worthless? But history shows with painful clarity that credentials are only as valuable as the institutions that recognize them. When those institutions collapse, the papers on the wall become genuinely irrelevant. In the early 1990s collapse of the Soviet Union, engineers, doctors, physicists, and economists who had spent decades building specialist expertise found their skills stranded. The Soviet economy had been a command economy, meaning the government decided what was produced, how much, and who received it, not markets. When that system dissolved and a chaotic version of market capitalism emerged, the credentials that had governed the old system were largely unrecognized by the new one. Soviet economic credentials and Soviet professional networks did not translate cleanly into the emerging market system. Many highly educated people, engineers at state factories, economists at central planning offices, military researchers, found themselves with no functional market for their skills. Not because they were not skilled, because the system that had valued those specific skills no longer existed. What emerged instead was survival by connection, not credential. Those who thrived were those who had black market networks. They had access to hard currency or personal relationships with the people in the new system who controlled actual resources. A degree was not currency. A relationship was currency. A connection to someone who could get things done in the new chaotic reality was currency. The credential had become an artifact of a world that was gone. Venezuela shows a more recent version of this pattern. Between 2015 and 2020, an estimated 5 million Venezuelans fled the country. Many of them were educated professionals. These included doctors, engineers, architects, and teachers. Venezuelan medical degrees were not universally recognized in neighboring Colombia, Brazil, or Peru. Venezuelan teachers could not simply walk into classrooms in other countries. The years of training they had completed were challenged. The certifications they had earned, the professional identities they had built, all of these had to be renegotiated or partially abandoned. Many Venezuelan doctors in Bogota and Lima worked as delivery drivers, security guards, or restaurant workers while waiting for recognition processes. These recognition processes could take years. Inside Venezuela, those who remained faced a different problem. Hospitals stopped receiving supplies. Medical equipment broke down and could not be replaced. A skilled surgeon's credentials meant nothing. The credentials meant nothing if the operating room had no anesthesia, no electricity, and no instruments that functioned. Formal employment status goes through an equally brutal transformation in national breakdown. Look at Argentina after 2001. The formal economy contracted so sharply that unemployment hit 25% officially. Underemployment was even higher. People were working far fewer hours than they needed, or working in jobs completely outside their training, estimated at 50%. The middle class, which had defined itself by white-collar employment and professional status, found itself scrambling. They entered what Argentines called the cartonero economy, collecting and sorting cardboard and metal from the streets to sell for recycling. Entire families who had been solidly middle class participated in this. It was not a fall to the bottom. It was the discovery that the floor had been lower than anyone thought. The things which had defined them lost value. Their job title, their office, and their professional status held value only as long as the institutions around them agreed to keep valuing them. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, about what is actually solid and what is merely promised, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. The fifth thing that becomes nearly worthless is real estate in the wrong location. This one shocks people the most. Real estate is supposed to be the ultimate hard asset. You can see it and touch it. It cannot be printed away. It does not evaporate like a bank balance. This is true. Real estate does not become worthless in the way currency does, but in specific circumstances, real estate can lose practical value. During national breakdown, it can sometimes become a net liability rather than an asset. The mechanism here is different. Real estate value is almost entirely dependent on three things: who wants to live there, the legal system, and infrastructure. Remove any one of these three, and the value collapses. Remove all three, and you have land. Look at what happened in Detroit, Michigan. This is not a national collapse, but a municipal one, illustrating the mechanism precisely. In 1950, Detroit had a population of nearly 1.85 million people. It was one of the wealthiest cities per capita. Homes in Detroit were valuable. Then over the following decades, the industrial base collapsed and population fled. Tax revenues fell, infrastructure deteriorated, and the legal system stopped effectively enforcing property rights in large sections of the city. By 2013, when Detroit filed for the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history, residential properties were selling for $1.